woke up this morning tired. Not the kind of tiredness that 8 hours fixes. Not the kind that a vacation fixes either. You know this because you've taken the vacation. You came back, and it was still there, waiting for you, patient as a creditor. Maybe you've been tired for years. You function. You show up. By every external measure, things are fine, stable enough, reasonable enough, survivable enough. And yet something underneath refuses to participate. It goes through the motions, but it won't commit. It performs life without inhabiting it. The part that frightens you most isn't the exhaustion. It's that you can't explain it without feeling ashamed. There's no catastrophe to point to. Nothing dramatic happened. You simply arrived, one ordinary morning, at a feeling of profound and wordless depletion. And you've been carrying it ever since, in silence, hoping it would eventually go away. It hasn't. Here's what nobody tells you. The kind of tiredness you're describing has nothing to do with how much you slept. It has nothing to do with how busy your schedule is, or how hard you work, or whether you meditate or exercise or take your supplements. It persists through all of that because it doesn't come from what you're doing. It comes from who you're being, or more precisely, from who you've spent years not being allowed to be. This is not burnout. Burnout is what happens when the demands on you exceed your capacity. What you have is different. Your capacity is intact. What's collapsed is the willingness. Some part of you has quietly withdrawn its cooperation. Not because it's broken, but because it's been waiting too long to be taken seriously. Carl Jung called this the cost of the persona. The persona, the psychological mask every human being constructs to navigate the world, is not a deception. It is a necessity. You built it to survive, to be acceptable to your family, legible to your profession, tolerable to your social environment. The problem isn't that you have one. The problem is what happens after years of maintaining it at the expense of everything underneath. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung wrote that many of his patients came to him not because they were clinically ill, but because they felt their lives had lost meaning. And that this loss of meaning, this hollow feeling at the center of a functional existence, was itself the illness. Not a symptom of something else, the illness itself. That hollow feeling is what this video is about. Not how to fill it, but how to understand what it's actually telling you. Because it is telling you something. And it has been, for longer than you've been willing to hear it. What comes next is not a diagnosis. It's a mirror. And what you see in it will depend entirely on how honest you're willing to be. Most people think the persona is a lie, a performance, something cynical and deliberate. The fake smile, the rehearsed answer, the version of yourself you put on for interviews and family dinners. If that were true, the solution would be simple. Take it off. Go be authentic. Problem solved. But Jung saw something far more unsettling. The persona isn't a lie you tell others. It's a lie you eventually tell yourself. It begins as adaptation, necessary, intelligent, even elegant. A child learns which parts of itself are welcome and which are not. A teenager learns what kind of person earns approval in their environment. A young adult shapes an identity around what works, what gets hired, what gets loved, what doesn't cause conflict. None of this is malicious. All of it is survival. The problem arrives later, quietly, without announcing itself. After years of inhabiting the mask, you stop noticing it's there. The distance between who you are and who you perform collapses, not because you became authentic, but because you forgot there was ever a difference. The persona doesn't just sit on top of the psyche. Given enough time and enough pressure, it fuses with it. You don't wear the mask anymore. You become it. And this is precisely when the exhaustion begins. Jung was clear about why. The persona demands constant energy to maintain. Every version of yourself that doesn't fit the mask has to be managed, suppressed, rerouted, kept out of sight. That management is invisible work. You don't feel yourself doing it, but you feel the cost, a flatness that doesn't lift, a restlessness that has no object, a creeping sense that the life you've built fits you the way a coat fits a stranger, technically wearable, fundamentally wrong. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung argued that modern life accelerates this process. Society doesn't want individuals, it wants functional units. It rewards the parts of you that are predictable, productive, and legible, and quietly penalizes everything else. The institutional pressures of career, family, and social belonging don't ask you to kill what doesn't fit. They simply make it inconvenient to keep it alive. And inconvenience, sustained long enough, is its own kind of erasure. What you're left with is a person who performs competently, relates appropriately, and meets the expectations placed on them, and who, in the privacy of their own inner life, feels like a stranger to themselves, not dramatically, not in a way that would show up on any scan, just a persistent, low-grade sense that something essential has been living in the dark for a very long time. The question isn't whether this happened to you. If you're still watching, it did. The question is, what has been accumulating down there, in the parts of you that the persona couldn't accommodate, and what it's been doing with all that time, because it hasn't been idle. In the next part, we'll go there, into the unlived life that doesn't disappear just because you stopped looking at it. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. There is a version of you that never got to exist. Not a fantasy version. Not a better, idealized self you failed to become. Something more specific and more uncomfortable than that. A set of genuine impulses, desires, identities, and ways of being that were present early, that were real, and that got quietly ruled out. Not through any single dramatic decision, but through 1,000 small accommodations. You learned what was acceptable, you adjusted, and what didn't fit got left behind. Jung called this the unlived life. And his most important insight about it wasn't that it causes suffering, it was that it doesn't disappear. This is the part most people miss. When you suppress something long enough, you stop thinking about it. It drops below the surface of conscious attention, and life moves on. But the psychic energy attached to it doesn't dissolve. It accumulates. It finds other channels. And eventually, it begins to move against you. Not because it wants to destroy you, but because it wants to exist. Because existence is what it was always trying to do before you learned to stop it. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, Jung described patients who came to him in the second half of life, successful, functional, socially adapted, carrying a weight they couldn't name. What he found, again and again, was not trauma in the conventional sense. It was unlived possibility, ambitions that had been deemed impractical, relationships that had been deemed inappropriate, aspects of character that had been deemed too much, too strange, too inconvenient to accommodate. None of it was gone. All of it had been waiting. You know this feeling, even if you've never had language for it. It's the inexplicable resistance to things that should, by all logic, be fine. The procrastination that has nothing to do with laziness. The irritability that attaches itself to the wrong targets. The sudden grief that arrives without occasion. These aren't malfunctions. They're transmissions. The unlived life, communicating through whatever channel it can find. The harder truth is this. The more tightly you've held the persona together, the more pressure has been building underneath it. The more successfully you've adapted to what was expected of you, the more of yourself you've had to leave out. And what gets left out doesn't wait patiently forever. At some point, it stops whispering and starts pushing. What you can do, right now, today, is begin to take the signals seriously instead of managing them. Not analyzing them into abstraction, but sitting with the specific question, what is this resistance actually pointing at? When the flatness arrives, instead of fighting it or explaining it away, Ask it what it's protecting. The answer won't come immediately, but the act of asking, genuinely, without agenda, is itself the beginning of a different relationship with what's been buried. The exhaustion you feel is not random. It has a shape, and that shape is what we need to look at next, because Jung had a precise name for what happens when the self stops cooperating, and understanding it changes everything about how you read your own life. In the next part, we go there. You were probably taught to think of exhaustion as an input-output problem. You spent more than you received. The solution, therefore, is to rest more, do less, recharge. This is the logic of burnout, and it is completely inadequate for what you are actually living. What Jung diagnosed is structurally different. It is not that you are spending too much. It is that what you are spending energy to sustain is not you. The central concept here is the self, and Jung distinguished it carefully from the ego. The ego is the conscious part of the psyche, the narrator, the planner, the manager of daily life. The self is something far larger. It is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, what you know about yourself and what remains in the shadows, what has been lived and what has been left behind. The ego is who you think you are. The self is who you actually are. And the self is not passive. When the ego constructs a life that systematically excludes essential parts of the psyche, when the persona becomes the only inhabited identity, and the unlived life continues accumulating pressure in the unconscious, the self begins to resist. Not dramatically, not with a visible collapse, but with a silent and relentless withdrawal of cooperation. The fatigue that won't lift is that withdrawal. The apathy is that withdrawal. The emptiness at the center of a functional life is that withdrawal. In the Undiscovered Self, Jung argued that modern man had lost contact with his instinctual foundations, with the deepest strata of the psyche that do not obey social logic, that cannot be rationalized into an acceptable identity, that exist independently of what culture expects from you, and that this loss of contact does not manifest as a dramatic event. It manifests as structural exhaustion, as the feeling that you are moving through life with something essential disconnected. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. This is the psyche's most honest communication, delivered not in words, but in the withdrawal of the energy required to keep pretending. The critical shift Jung demands is this: stop treating the exhaustion as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a message to be read. The question is no longer, how do I recover my energy? The question is, what has been consuming it that you have never consciously authorized? What is the self trying to make room for that the ego has been refusing to acknowledge? This reframe is not comfortable, because the moment you take it seriously, you can no longer outsource the problem to your schedule, your circumstances, or your biology. The exhaustion stops being something that happened to you and starts being something that is happening in you, a pressure from below, intelligent and purposeful, pointing toward a life that is larger than the one you have allowed yourself to live. And this pressure tends to reach a peak at a very specific moment, one that Jung mapped with unusual precision, a turning point that most people experience as collapse, but which is, if you know how to read it, something else entirely. That is where we're going next. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a moment, and you may already be in it, when the structure that carried you stops working. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but the ambitions that once felt urgent begin to feel hollow. The identity you built with such effort starts to fit strangely. The things you were certain you wanted, you achieved, and found that the wanting had quietly died somewhere along the way. What used to feel like direction now feels like inertia. You are still moving, but you no longer know why. Jung mapped this moment with more precision than almost anyone before or since. He called it the turning point of the middle of life, and he was careful to say that it had nothing to do with age in any simple biological sense. It arrives whenever the values, the orientation, and the identity of the first half of life exhaust their usefulness. Whenever the ego, having successfully built a life around adaptation and achievement, runs out of road. He compared it to the movement of the sun. In the morning, the sun rises, expanding, brightening, moving outward. Everything in the first half of life follows this logic: build, acquire, achieve, establish. But at noon, something shifts. The same trajectory that produced the ascent now produces the descent. And the person who tries to keep climbing using the same strategies, the same values, the same definition of success, that person, Jung said, pays for it with their soul. In Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he wrote about the patients who arrived at his practice in this exact condition. Externally, their lives were intact. Internally, something had gone dark. They had done everything right, and arrived at a destination that felt like a dead end. What they were experiencing wasn't failure. It was the psyche's way of signaling that the first half's agenda was complete, and that something else was now required, something the ego alone could not provide. This is the moment most people misread as collapse, and the misreading is costly, because if you treat it as collapse, you respond with repair. You try to restore what was working. You push harder, optimize more, add new strategies on top of old foundations, and the exhaustion deepens, because the psyche is not asking to be repaired, it is asking to be transformed. The difference between collapse and threshold is everything. Collapse is the end of something. Threshold is the beginning of something you have not yet been. And what stands on the other side of it, what Jung spent his entire career trying to name, is a relationship with the full depth of who you actually are, rather than the narrow slice of it that your circumstances required you to inhabit. You cannot think your way across that threshold. You cannot optimize your way across it. What you can do, and what the next part will ask of you, is begin to listen differently to what the exhaustion has been trying to say all along. Because underneath it, there is something specific, something that has been waiting with extraordinary patience, and it is time to find out what it is. Stop trying to fix it for a moment, not permanently, not as a philosophy, just long enough to ask a different question, because the question you've been asking hasn't worked. How do I recover? How do I get my energy back? How do I feel like myself again? These are reasonable questions. They are also the wrong ones. They assume exhaustion is an obstacle between you and the life you want. Jung would say the opposite. Exhaustion is the most direct path to it. Every persistent symptom in the psyche is protecting something. The anxiety that won't resolve is guarding a truth you haven't been willing to look at. The numbness that descends after years of overperformance is preserving what little is left of a self that was never given permission to fully exist. And the exhaustion, the specific, structural, rest-resistant exhaustion this video has been tracing, is protecting the unlived life underneath it. It is the pressure of everything that has been compressed, rerouted, and denied, pushing upward against the weight of who you've agreed to be. This is not a metaphor. Jung was precise about the mechanics. When psychic energy cannot flow in its natural direction, toward genuine expression, toward what the self actually requires, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, and it begins to deform whatever it touches. Relationships feel flat because the energy that should animate them is locked elsewhere. Work feels meaningless because the investment required to care about it exceeds what the depleted ego can provide. Pleasure becomes difficult to access Because pleasure requires presence, and presence requires that you actually be there, not the persona, not the performed version, but you. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung argued that genuine self-knowledge, the kind that actually changes something, is not knowledge about your conscious personality. It is knowledge of what your conscious personality has excluded. The ego knows its preferences, its habits, its history. What it doesn't know, and what it is often deeply resistant to knowing, is the nature of what it has refused. And it is precisely that refusal that is costing you everything. So here is the question that matters, not who you have been. You know that answer too well. But what did you want before you learned what was acceptable to want? What impulse did you root around so many times that you stopped noticing you were doing it? What version of your life did you quietly grieve and then decide to stop grieving because grieving it felt self-indulgent? Sit with that. Not to excavate it into a therapy session or a 5-year plan. Just to acknowledge that it exists. Because the first movement of individuation, the process Jung described as becoming who you actually are, is not action, it is recognition. It is the moment you stop managing the signal and start receiving it. The exhaustion has been telling you something specific. Not that you need more rest, not that you need a better routine, that something in you is still waiting to be lived, and that the cost of not living it is no longer sustainable. What happens when you finally decide to listen is where we're going next, and it will ask more of you than anything else in this video. Nothing about what comes next is comfortable. That is worth saying plainly, without softening it. Individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming who you actually are as opposed to who you were shaped to be, is not a destination you arrive at. It is not a breakthrough moment after which everything reorganizes itself into clarity and ease. It is a sustained, often disorienting confrontation with the parts of yourself that have been living in exile. And it asks something of you that no technique, no routine, and no amount of self-awareness can substitute for: the willingness to let the old structure fail. This is the hardest truth of everything this video has built toward. The life that is exhausting you is not exhausting you despite being functional. It is exhausting you because of it, because it works well enough to justify maintaining, because it contains just enough comfort, just enough familiarity, just enough evidence that dismantling it would be irrational. The persona does not hold you in place with chains, it holds you with reasonableness. And reasonableness is far harder to walk away from. Jung understood this with uncommon honesty. In The Undiscovered Self, he wrote that the individual is the only real carrier of life, that society, the state, the institution are abstractions, and that everything which actually matters happens inside a single human being, not in the aggregate, not in the collective, in you specifically, with your specific unlived life, and your specific exile, and your specific exhaustion. He wrote that the fate of the world depends, in the end, on the psychological condition of individuals, each one a makeweight that tips the scales in one direction or another, toward consciousness or away from it. That is not a flattering metaphor designed to make you feel important. It is a demand. It means that the work of becoming yourself is not a private luxury. It is the only contribution that cannot be outsourced or replaced. Anyone can perform your role. No one else can live your life. And if you don't, it remains unlived. Not symbolic unlived. Actually, materially, permanently unlived. So what does this ask of you, concretely? Not a plan, not a list. One thing. Begin to make decisions from the inside out rather than the outside in. The next time you feel the pull of what is expected versus what is true, notice it. Don't perform the override automatically. Sit in the discomfort of that gap for long enough to ask which voice is the persona and which is something older and more essential. You will not always be able to tell, but the practice of asking, sustained, honest, repeated, is itself the process. That is what individuation looks like on a Tuesday morning. Not transformation. Recognition, followed by one small choice that honors what was recognized. The exhaustion that brought you here was not a malfunction. It was the most honest thing your psyche has said to you in years. The question now is whether you are willing to take it seriously, not as a problem to resolve, but as an invitation to become someone you have not yet had the courage to be. If something in this video landed differently than you expected, the one appearing on your screen right now will take it further. Click to keep watching.